was staring at my computer screen, mentally calculating how many more hours of overtime I'd need to finish the quarterly report, when I felt something brush against my ankle. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after 10 straight hours of work. My heat suppressants had been making me foggy all week, and I'd been running on caffeine and stubbornness since Monday morning. But then I felt it again, a deliberate, gentle pressure against my shoe, almost like a small hand testing whether I was real. My heart jumped. I slowly rolled my chair back, peering under the desk with the kind of caution reserved for office spiders and unexpected HR visits. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. A small boy, no older than 7, was curled up in the shadows beneath my workspace. His knees were pulled tight to his chest, and his wide eyes glistened with unshed tears that threatened to spill down his flushed cheeks. His dark hair was a mess of tangles, and his little hands were trembling as they clutched the edge of my pant leg with surprising strength. "Please don't tell anyone I'm here," he whispered, his tiny voice trembling with fear. I froze completely, my mind struggling to process what was happening. How did a child end up in our office building at 9 o'clock at night? Why was he hiding? And more importantly, why did he look so terrified, like he was hiding from something much worse than a scolding? "Hey there," I started gently, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring despite the sudden spike in my own anxiety. "What are you doing, UND?" The conference room doors burst open before I could finish my sentence, and my entire body went rigid. 3 men strode out of the conference room, and the air in the entire floor changed immediately. The kind of presence that made everyone in the vicinity straighten their posture, even when they weren't consciously aware of doing so. They were tall, all of them easily over 6 feet, with sharp jawlines, perfectly tailored charcoal suits that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and expressions set in that practiced mask of controlled authority that made even senior executives nervous. I had never spoken directly to any of them before. They existed in a completely different stratosphere from junior analysts like me. We were separated by at least 5 organizational levels, countless zeros in salary difference, and what felt like an unbridgeable social chasm. Ethan Howard, the CEO. The eldest of the triplets by 7 minutes, according to office gossip. His steel-gray eyes swept across the office floor with unusual intensity, cataloging every corner, every shadow, every possible hiding spot. Marcus Howard, the CFO. The middle triplet, with the kind of calculated stillness that made you feel like he could see straight through your skull and read every thought you'd ever had. His gaze was colder than his brother's, more analytical. Liam Howard, the COO. The youngest of the 3, though you'd never know it from the way he carried himself, with a restless energy that suggested he was always 2 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Right now, that energy was focused, sharp, almost predatory. And then their eyes landed directly on me. All 3 of them. Ethan began walking toward my desk with measured, purposeful steps that made my pulse race uncontrollably. Marcus flanked him on the left, Liam on the right, a formation that screamed coordinated, practiced, and absolutely intentional. Were they, looking for the child? Had someone already reported seeing a boy in the building? My palms started sweating as they came closer, each footfall echoing in my ears like a countdown to something I couldn't predict. The scent of 3 dominant alphas hit me all at once, cedar and something sharp from Ethan, rain-soaked earth and ozone from Marcus, and a warm, leather and spice from Liam. Even with my suppressants dulling my senses, the combined force of their presence made my omega instincts curl into a tight, defensive ball in the back of my mind. "Excuse me," Ethan said. His voice was deep and controlled, but there was an underlying current of something I'd never heard from him before. Worry. Perhaps even desperation. "Have you noticed a child wandering around this floor?" Before I could even attempt to formulate a response, I felt the boy's grip on my ankle tighten painfully. I glanced down for just a fraction of a second and saw his pleading expression, those desperate eyes begging me not to reveal his hiding spot. There was something in that look that bypassed all my rational thoughts about corporate hierarchy, professional consequences, and the three alphas currently radiating enough authority to make my hindbrain want to submit on the spot. "No, sir," I heard myself say, somehow managing to keep my voice steady despite the lie. "I haven't seen anyone. Just been focused on these reports all evening." Ethan studied my face with an intensity that made me feel like he could see straight through me. Those penetrating gray eyes seemed to catalog every micro-expression, every nervous twitch, every bead of sweat forming on my forehead. Next to him, Marcus had gone completely still, his head tilted slightly like he was listening to something beyond the range of normal hearing. Liam had moved to the side, positioning himself so he could see both me and the area around my desk from a different angle. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. I forced myself to maintain eye contact with Ethan, even though every instinct screamed at me to look away, to submit, to tell him the truth. My omega instincts were warring with my rational mind. One part of me wanted to prove I could be trusted, the other part wanted to throw myself at his feet and beg forgiveness for the lie I just told. Finally, after what must have been only seconds but felt like hours, Ethan gave a slight nod. "If you do see him, please notify security immediately. It's important." "Of course, sir," I managed to reply. He turned and walked toward the elevators, his brothers falling into step beside him like they were attached by invisible strings. Marcus glanced back once, just for a moment, and something flickered in his eyes, curiosity, maybe, or suspicion. Then the elevator doors closed behind them, and the three of them were gone. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands were trembling as I ducked my head back under the desk. "Okay, kiddo," I whispered, trying to sound gentle but firm. "You need to tell me what's going on. Those men who were just here, they're looking for you, aren't they?" They seemed really worried. The boy's lower lip trembled, and fresh tears started rolling down his cheeks. "They're my dad's, but I just make everything harder for them. I heard them on the phone yesterday, saying how exhausting it is to juggle everything. They meant me. I'm the thing that's too much trouble." My chest tightened painfully at his words. This tiny human being, probably in second or third grade, was carrying around guilt and self-blame that no child should ever feel. I could hear the genuine anguish in his voice, the belief that he was somehow a burden to the three men who had been searching for him with barely concealed terror in their eyes. "Listen to me carefully," I said, shifting to sit cross-legged on the floor so I could look at him properly. "Adults say things when they're stressed that don't mean what kids think they mean. Your dads aren't tired of you. They're probably tired because they work so hard to give you a good life. There's a huge difference." He looked at me with skeptical, red-rimmed eyes. "But they're always busy. Always in meetings or on calls. Sometimes I think they forget I'm even there. If I tell them where I am now, they'll just go back to work and forget about me again." The raw pain in those words hit me harder than I expected. This wasn't just a child acting out or playing a prank. This was a lonely kid, desperate to get his father's attention in the only way he knew how. And three alphas, powerful, driven, probably overwhelmed by running a billion-dollar company while trying to raise a child alone, who had no idea how to bridge the gap between their responsibilities and their son's emotional needs. "What's your name?" I asked softly. "Noah," he sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "Okay, Noah. Here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna walk with you to find your dads, and I promise, I absolutely promise, that I'll make sure they understand how you're feeling. You won't have to do this alone." Noah studied my face for a long moment, probably trying to determine if he could trust this random stranger who'd just lied to his fathers for him. Slowly, he nodded and extended his small hand toward me. I took it carefully, noting how small and fragile it felt in my palm, and helped him crawl out from under the desk. His scent hit me then, faint, childlike, with the barest undertones of his father's Alphan scents mingled together in a way that made my Omega instincts ache with something I didn't want to name. We walked together through the now mostly empty office, past abandoned cubicles and darkened conference rooms, toward the executive floor. As we rounded the corner to the elevator bank, I nearly collided with someone. Ethan Howard stood there like a statue, arms crossed over his chest. Marcus and Liam flanked him on either side, and all three of them were watching us with expressions that ranged from relieved to absolutely unreadable. Ethan's eyes fixed on Noah first, and something in his face cracked open, relief so profound it looked almost painful. Then his gaze shifted to me, and this time there was something different in it. Not just gratitude for bringing his son back, but something more complex. Curiosity. Assessment. The kind of scrutiny that made me feel like I was being weighed and measured against standards I didn't know existed. "Thank you for bringing him to me," Ethan said quietly, but his gaze never left my face. He was studying me again, but this time it felt different. More personal somehow. His scent intensified, that cedar-and-sharp combination that made my hindbrain want to lean closer, even as my rational mind screamed at me to maintain distance. "It was nothing, Mr. Howard. I just—" "Noah," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying an unmistakable note of parental authority. "You know you can't run away like that. This building isn't safe for children to wander alone. We've been searching for you for almost an hour." Noah dropped his gaze to the floor, guilt written across his small features. But then, in a moment that surprised all of us, he gripped my hand tighter and looked up at his father's with sudden determination. "I want this man to stay with me," Noah announced, his voice small but firm. "He's nice. He listened to me." The words hung in the air between us. I felt all three sets of alpha eyes shift from their son to me with new intensity. There was calculation there now, and something else I couldn't quite identify. A question forming behind those analytical gazes. "What's your name?" Liam asked, and though the question was simple, the way he asked it felt weighted with significance. His eyes traveled over me with an appreciation that made my cheeks warm, taking in my rumpled shirt, my tired eyes, the way I was still holding Noah's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Liam," Ethan said sharply, and something passed between the three brothers, a silent communication I couldn't read. "Leo Carter, sir," I replied, trying desperately to maintain some semblance of professionalism despite the surreal nature of this entire situation. "I'm in the analytics department." Ethan nodded slowly, but he continued to stare at me with that unreadable expression. I could practically see the wheels turning in his mind, processing, analyzing, filing away every detail of this encounter for future reference. Marcus had moved slightly closer, his head tilting as he scented the air. I watched his nostrils flare almost imperceptibly, and something shifted in his expression. "Your suppressants," Marcus said quietly. It wasn't a question. My face burned. Yes. I'm on suppressants. Strong ones. For work. The dose is too high, he observed, his voice clinical, detached. Your scent is practically non-existent. That's not healthy for an Omega. I had no idea how to respond to that. Before I could formulate any kind of answer, Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself between me and his brothers in a gesture that was either protective or possessive, I couldn't tell which. We'll discuss this further, Ethan said, his voice brooking no argument. Tomorrow morning. My office. 9 o'clock. I have a meeting at. Cancel it. And then they were gone, 3 alphas and 1 small boy, disappearing into the executive elevator like a well-rehearsed exit strategy. But just before the doors closed, Noah looked back at me and smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen on his face all evening, and it made something warm bloom in my chest despite the cold knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. The next morning arrived with the kind of bright sunshine that felt almost offensive given my state of exhausted confusion. I had barely slept, my mind replaying the strange encounter with Noah and his fathers on an endless loop. Every time I'd closed my eyes, I saw those pleading looks from the child and those penetrating stares from three alphas who seemed to see far more than they should. I was halfway through my third cup of coffee, trying to focus on a spreadsheet that kept blurring before my eyes, when my phone vibrated sharply against my desk. The notification made my stomach drop. Mr. Howard requests your presence in his office. Please come immediately. My coffee went cold in my hand as I stared at the message. A direct summons from the CEO, no, from all three of them, based on the wording, could only mean one of two things. Either I was about to be fired for lying to them yesterday, or something even more complicated was about to happen. Neither option seemed particularly appealing. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending toward my own execution. I adjusted my tie 3 times, checked my reflection in the polished steel doors, and tried to rehearse what I might say if they confronted me about my dishonesty. The suppressants were making my head foggy again, and I could feel the edges of my omega instincts fraying under the stress. By the time I reached their office suite, my shirt collar felt too tight and my hands were clammy. Their assistant, a sharply dressed beta woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, barely glanced up as she gestured toward the imposing double doors. Go right in. They're expecting you. I pushed open the doors and stepped into an office that was more intimidating than I'd imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city below. The furniture was all sleek lines and expensive materials, leather, dark wood, and brushed steel. Everything screamed power and success. But what caught me completely off guard was the sight of Noah, sitting on the plush carpet near a massive desk, surrounded by toy cars that he was arranging into an elaborate traffic pattern. When he saw me, his entire face transformed with joy. Leo! He exclaimed, scrambling to his feet. You came back! 3 desks dominated the space, a triangular arrangement that allowed all 3 brothers to work simultaneously while maintaining visual contact. Ethan was seated behind the central desk, fingers steepled in front of him. Marcus occupied the desk to his left, his laptop open, his attention fixed on me with laser-like precision. Liam was perched on the edge of the right-hand desk, arms crossed, watching the entire interaction with undisguised curiosity. Today, all 3 of them wore navy suits that probably cost more than my car. Their expressions were carefully neutral, the faces of men who'd perfected the art of revealing nothing. But their sense filled the room, and even through my suppressants, I could feel the weight of 3 alphas assessing me from every angle. Mr. Carter, Ethan said, his voice professionally cordial. Please sit down. We have some things to discuss. I lowered myself into the chair across from him, feeling like I was about to negotiate a hostage situation rather than have a conversation with my boss's bosses. Noah immediately abandoned his cars and came to sit on the floor beside me, his small hand resting on my knee with a familiarity that made my heart ache. I'll be direct, because I value both our time, Ethan began, leaning back slightly in his leather chair. What happened yesterday was not the first time Noah has tried to run away or hide from us. He's been struggling since his mother passed away 2 years ago, and finding connections with people has become increasingly difficult for him. I stayed quiet, sensing that he needed to say this without interruption. However, Marcus continued, his cool voice picking up seamlessly from his brother's, in the 5 minutes you spent with our son yesterday, you managed to earn more of his trust than 3 professional therapists have earned in 6 months. He talked about you all night, about how you didn't treat him like he was broken or problematic, about how you just listened. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, unsure where this was heading or what response they expected from me. We need someone for Noah, Liam said, and there was something almost vulnerable in the way he said it, like the admission cost him something. Not a therapist he'll resist, not a nanny he'll resent. Someone genuine who can be a positive presence in his life during this difficult time. My mouth went dry as I began to understand what they were suggesting. Mr. Howards, I'm not qualified for childcare. I'm just an analyst who happened to. That's precisely why you're qualified, Ethan cut me off, but not unkindly. You're not approaching him with clinical techniques or professional distance. You treated him like a real person with real feelings. That's what he needs. That's what we need for him. He paused, studying my reaction carefully before continuing. We're prepared to offer you a significant supplemental income to spend time with Noah, weekends, some evenings when our schedules are particularly demanding. Nothing inappropriate or excessive. Just being someone he can talk to, someone who can help him feel less alone. The offer was so unexpected, so far outside the realm of normal corporate interactions, that I struggled to process it. These were men who commanded billion-dollar deals, who made decisions that affected thousands of employees. And they were asking me, a junior analyst they'd never spoken to before yesterday, to help with their son. I understand this is unusual, Marcus added, and I detected something in his voice that surprised me, uncertainty, maybe even fear that I'd refuse. And I want to be clear that your regular job performance and standing in the company won't be affected regardless of your answer. This is entirely separate. We're asking you as fathers, not as your employers. Before I could formulate any kind of response, Noah appeared at my elbow, having abandoned his cars. He looked up at me with those same hopeful eyes from yesterday. Please, Leo, he said quietly. My dads try really hard, but they have to work a lot, and I get scared sometimes when I'm alone. You made me feel safe yesterday. Like maybe I wasn't such a problem after all. The simple honesty of his words shattered whatever professional reservations I'd been constructing. Here was a child who'd lost his mother, who felt like a burden to his remaining parents, who was drowning in loneliness despite living in a penthouse that probably had more square footage than my entire apartment building. Okay, I heard myself say before my rational brain could interfere. I'll do it. I can't promise I'll be great at it, but I'll try my best. Noah's smile was brilliant and uncomplicated, the kind of pure joy that only children can produce. He threw his arms around my waist in an impulsive hug that caught me completely off guard. When I looked up at the triplets, expecting to see professional relief or satisfaction at a successful negotiation, I instead caught something else flickering across all three of their faces. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by their usual controlled expressions, but I'd seen it, a flash of something raw and complicated that looked almost like longing. Possessiveness. Interest. Thank you, Leo, Ethan said, and his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. I think this might be exactly what we all need. The first Saturday arrived with a gray, overcast sky that matched my uncertain mood. I'd spent the week overthinking every aspect of this arrangement, what I should wear, what I should say, how I should behave around three alphas who seemed to see straight through all my carefully constructed defenses. When I arrived at the penthouse, the door was opened by Liam, who looked completely different in casual clothes. Gone was the severe business suit, replaced by dark jeans and a simple gray Henley that made him look younger and somehow more human. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. Leo, he greeted me with a smile that transformed his usually intense face. Come in. Noah's been counting down the hours since breakfast. The penthouse was exactly what you'd expect from three successful alphas, all clean lines, expensive furniture, and artwork that probably cost more than most people's houses. But it lacked the warmth that makes a space feel like a home. There were no family photos on display, no clutter, no signs of daily life being lived here. It felt more like a luxury hotel suite than a place where a child was growing up. The other two are in a meeting, Liam explained, leading me through the vast living space. They'll join us later. Noah's in his room, he's been setting up his blocks all morning, waiting for you to help him build a castle. Before I could respond, Noah came running out of his bedroom, his face breaking into that uninhibited grin that seemed reserved just for me. You actually came! He shouted, grabbing both my hands and pulling me forward with surprising strength for such a small person. I wasn't sure you'd really show up. Of course I came, I told him, squeezing his hands gently. I promised, didn't I? The next 2 hours passed in a blur of construction projects and non-stop chatter. Noah told me about his school, his favorite teacher Mrs. Patterson, the kid in his class who could burp the alphabet, and how much he missed his mom's chocolate chip cookies. He mentioned his mother naturally, without the awkward sadness that adults usually brought to the topic, and I followed his lead, acknowledging her memory without dwelling in sorrow. At one point, I needed to use the bathroom and found myself walking back through the main living area. Ethan and Marcus had emerged from what I assumed was their home office, and both of them were standing near the windows, their voices low and urgent. The air in the room shifted the moment I entered. I could feel their attention snap to me like I'd triggered some kind of alarm. Leo, Ethan said, his voice carefully controlled. Come here for a moment. I approached cautiously, my Omega instincts warring between curiosity and the urge to submit to the clear command in his tone. Up close, both of them looked tired, not just physically exhausted, but emotionally drained in a way that sleep couldn't fix. We wanted to talk to you alone, Marcus said, his cool gaze fixed on me with unsettling intensity. Without Noah present. Is something wrong? I asked, my heart starting to race. No, Ethan said quickly. Nothing like that. It's just, you need to understand something about our situation. About why Noah responded to you the way he did. I waited, sensing that they needed to say this without interruption. When Sarah died, Ethan began, his jaw tightening slightly at the mention of his late wife. We shut down emotionally. All three of us. We threw ourselves into work because it was easier than facing the grief, easier than dealing with the pain of losing someone who was supposed to be our bondmate. Noah suffered for that. We see that now. But what we didn't expect, Marcus continued, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it, was that bringing you into Noah's life would force us to feel again. To want something we'd convinced ourselves we couldn't have. I stared at him, my mouth suddenly dry. I don't understand. What are you saying? Ethan stepped closer, and I had to force myself not to step back. His scent washed over me, cedar and something sharp, overwhelming, intoxicating. Even through my suppressants, I could feel the pull of his alpha presence, the way my Omega instincts wanted to lean into him, to submit to. We're saying, Ethan said quietly, that we're attracted to you. All three of us. And we need to know if you feel the same way. The confession hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. Wait, I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. You, all of you. Together? Liam had appeared in the doorway, and I realized he'd been listening the entire time. He moved to stand beside his brothers, and the three of them formed a wall of alpha presence that made my hindbrain want to roll over and bare my throat. We share everything, Liam said simply. Everything. And when we find someone we want, we approach them together. It's how it's always been between us. But I'm an Omega, I said stupidly, as if they hadn't noticed. I work for you. This is insane. Is it? Marcus asked, and there was something almost challenging in his voice. When was the last time you felt truly wanted, Leo? When was the last time you felt like you mattered to someone? The question hit too close to home. I couldn't answer it. Couldn't admit that the only time I'd felt seen in months was when a 7-year-old boy had crawled under my desk and decided I was worth trusting. "We know this is complicated," Ethan said, and there was vulnerability in his voice now, raw and unguarded. "We know there are power imbalances and professional ethics and 1,000 reasons why this is a terrible idea. But we also know that Noah chose you for a reason. And we hope, that maybe you chose us too. Even if you didn't know it yet." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had descended over my thoughts. "This is too much. I can't, I need to think. I need time." "Take all the time you need," Liam said gently. "But don't run away from this. Not unless you're absolutely sure you don't want it." I escaped to the bathroom and stood there for a long moment, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My cheeks were flushed, my heart was racing, and I could still smell their combined scents clinging to my clothes. Cedar and rain and leather. 3 alphas. 3 impossibly powerful, impossibly attractive alphas who had just told me they wanted me. Together. I splashed cold water on my face and tried to think clearly. This was insane. This was the kind of thing that happened in cheesy romance novels, not in real life. I was a junior analyst with debt and a tiny apartment and a lifetime of feeling invisible. They were billionaires with power and influence and the kind of presence that made people tremble. And yet, when I thought about Noah's smile, about the way he'd clung to my hand like I was the only safe thing in his world, about the way his fathers had looked at me with something that might have been hope, something in my chest ached with longing I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. When I returned to the living area, Noah was waiting for me with his block castle half-built. His fathers were gone, back to their meeting, presumably, and for a moment, it was just the two of us again. "Are you okay, Leo?" Noah asked, his small face creased with worry. "You look funny." I managed a smile. "I'm fine, buddy. Just thinking about some adult stuff." "You're not going to leave, are you?" he asked, and there was a tremor in his voice that broke my heart. "You promised you'd stay." I crouched down to his level and looked him in the eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, Noah. I promise." He threw his arms around my neck, and I held him close, breathing in his childlike scent and trying to ignore the way my omega instincts were screaming at me that this was where I belonged. With this family. With these alphas who had somehow, impossibly, found me. 2 weeks later, everything changed. I'd been spending weekends with Noah, and a few evenings during the week, and somewhere in the midst of all that time together, I'd stopped thinking about the triplets as my bosses and started thinking about them as something else entirely. Something I wasn't ready to name. It was a Thursday evening when the call came. My phone buzzed with a number I'd memorized but hadn't yet saved. "Leo," Ethan's voice came through, and there was something in it that made my blood run cold. "We need you at the penthouse. It's Noah. He's asking for you. He won't calm down." "What happened?" I asked, already grabbing my keys and heading for the door. "He had a nightmare. A bad one. He's been crying for an hour, and nothing we do helps. He keeps calling your name. I'm on my way." The drive to the penthouse was a blur of red lights and anxious thoughts. By the time I arrived, I was shaking with adrenaline and worry. Liam opened the door before I could knock, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. "He's in his room," Liam said. "He won't let us near him. Just keeps saying he wants you." I walked through the penthouse on autopilot, my omega instinct screaming at me that a child was in distress, that I needed to help, that nothing else mattered. When I pushed open Noah's door, I found him curled up in the corner of his bed, his face wet with tears, his whole body shaking with sobs. "Noah," I said softly, moving toward him. "Hey, buddy. I'm here. I'm right here." He looked up at me with eyes so full of fear and desperation that my heart cracked. "Leo," he gasped. I thought you were gone. I thought you left like Mom did. I'm not gone, I said, sitting on the edge of his bed and pulling him into my arms. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. You're safe. He clung to me like I was the only solid thing in his world, and I held him close, rocking him gently and murmuring reassurances until his sobs faded to hiccups, and then to quiet sniffles. Don't leave, he whispered against my chest. Please. I can't lose anyone else. I pressed a kiss to the top of his head. You won't. I promise. When I finally looked up, the triplets were standing in the doorway, watching us. All three of them had expressions I couldn't quite read: relief, yes, but something else too. Something that looked suspiciously like wonder. How did you do that? Marcus asked quietly. We tried everything. Nothing helped. I shrugged, still holding Noah close. He just needed to feel safe. To know he wasn't alone. Ethan moved into the room, and for a moment, I thought he was going to take Noah from me. Instead, he sat on the bed beside me, his shoulder pressing against mine. Marcus and Liam followed, positioning themselves on the other side of the bed, creating a circle of warmth around the small boy in my arms. We should probably talk about what's happening between us, Ethan said quietly, his gray eyes finding mine in the dim light. I know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Noah's not the only one who needs you, Liam added, and there was something raw in his voice that made my chest ache. We've been trying to do this alone for 2 years. We didn't realize how much we needed someone until you showed up. I don't know what you want from me, I admitted. I don't know what I can give you. I'm just me. You're everything, Marcus said simply. You're everything we didn't know we were looking for. Noah shifted in my arms, and I felt his breathing even out as he finally fell asleep. The three alphas watched him, then looked at me, and in that moment, I knew that whatever came next, I was already in too deep to turn back. Stay tonight, Ethan said. Don't go home. Not after this. I should have said no. I should have maintained professional distance, protected myself from the complications that were inevitable in a situation like this. But when I looked at Noah's peaceful face, at the vulnerable hope in his father's eyes, I couldn't find the strength to refuse. Okay, I said softly. I'll stay. That night was the first of many. I slept in Noah's room, curled up on a chair beside his bed, but at some point during the night, I woke to find myself in the master bedroom, surrounded by 3 sleeping alphas who had apparently decided that leaving me alone wasn't an option. You're awake, Marcus murmured, his voice low and rough with sleep. Go back to sleep. You need rest. What's happening here? I asked, my voice barely audible. What are we doing? We're figuring it out, Liam said from somewhere on my other side. Together. That's all that matters. I should have panicked. I should have pushed them away, demanded space, insisted on boundaries. Instead, I let myself sink into the warmth of 3 alpha bodies surrounding me, and I slept more deeply than I had in years. The next morning, everything felt different. I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Noah's laughter echoing from somewhere in the penthouse. For a moment, I was disoriented. This wasn't my apartment, wasn't my life, and then I remembered everything and felt my heart stutter in my chest. He's awake, Marcus said from the doorway, and there was something intimate in the way he looked at me that made my cheeks flush. Did you sleep well? Too well, I admitted, sitting up and running a hand through my tangled hair. I haven't slept like that in years. That's what happens when you finally let yourself be taken care of, Marcus observed, and there was a satisfaction in his voice that made me want to hide under the blankets. I showered and dressed in borrowed clothes, Liam's shirt, Ethan's sweatpants, socks that Marcus had left on the bathroom counter like he knew I'd need them. By the time I emerged, breakfast was waiting on the dining table, and all three alphas were watching me with expressions that made me feel like I was the only person in the world. "Sit down," Ethan said, gesturing to the empty chair. "Eat. You need to keep your strength up." "I'm not an invalid," I protested, but I sat down anyway and let them pile food onto my plate. Noah was already eating, his mood restored after the previous night's emotional ordeal. "You're staying for real now, right?" he asked, his eyes bright with hope. "You're not just visiting?" I looked at his fathers, searching for guidance, but they were watching me with expressions that said the decision was mine. "I'm staying," I said finally. "But I still have my apartment, and I still have my job, and—" "Your job is safe," Liam interrupted. "We made sure of that. You're not losing anything by being with us." "Except maybe my sanity," I muttered, but I was smiling when I said it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments. I moved most of my things to the penthouse. I kept my apartment, just in case, a safety net that the triplets didn't push me to abandon. I continued going to work, continued doing my job, continued pretending that nothing had changed when I was in the office. But everything had changed. The suppressants were the first thing to go. Marcus had been right, the dose was too high, and it was affecting my health in ways I hadn't even noticed. Without them, my scent began to emerge, and the triplets' reactions to it were immediate and intense. "You smell amazing," Liam said one evening, burying his face in my neck. "I can't believe we missed this for so long." "It's overwhelming," I admitted, my voice shaky. "I'm not used to feeling this much." "You'll get used to it," Ethan assured me, his arms wrapping around me from behind. "We'll make sure of it." But the biggest adjustment was the dynamic itself. 3 alphas and 1 omega, all figuring out how to exist together without stepping on each other's boundaries or triggering instincts that none of us fully understood. "We need to talk about bonding," Marcus said one evening, his voice carefully neutral. "About heats, and about what happens when it's time." My face burned. "I'm not ready for that conversation." "You will be," he said gently. "And when you are, we'll be here. All of us." The first heat came when I least expected it. I'd been feeling off all day, warm, restless, with a neediness that I couldn't quite explain. By the time I made it back to the penthouse, I was shaking, my whole body aching with a desire I'd been suppressing for years. "Leo," Ethan said, his eyes widening as he scented me. "You're—" "I know," I gasped. "It's happening. I can't, I need—" "We've got you," Liam said, appearing at my side. "We've got you. Just let go. We'll take care of everything." And they did. 3 alphas, all focused on my pleasure, all committed to making sure I felt safe and cherished and wanted. The heat burned through me for 3 days, and they were there for every moment of it, holding me, soothing me, claiming me in ways that I'd only ever dreamed of. By the end, I was exhausted and sated and absolutely certain that I'd made the right choice. "We should talk about bonding," Marcus said again, his voice gentle but firm. "About marking you properly. Making it permanent. Is that what you want?" I asked, looking at all 3 of them. "It's what we've always wanted," Ethan said. "Since the moment we saw you under your desk, protecting our son. Since the moment we realized you were ours." I didn't have the strength to argue. I didn't want to. "Okay," I said softly. "Bond me. Mark me. Make me yours." It wasn't a single bonding, it was 3, spread out over a week, each one more intimate and overwhelming than the last. Ethan marked me first, his teeth sinking into the sensitive skin of my neck with a precision that made me see stars. Marcus followed the next day, claiming a spot on the other side. And on the final day, Liam took the center, his scent mixing with his brother's until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "You're ours now," Ethan said, running his thumb over the fresh marks on my neck. "Completely and permanently ours." "I've always been yours," I admitted, and it was the truth. "I just didn't know it until you found me." A year later, I stood in the penthouse, watching Noah build another castle with his blocks, and I couldn't stop smiling. The triplets were in their home office, working on something that was probably important but that I didn't care about, because they'd be out in an hour for dinner, and then we'd all be together again, the way we were every night. "Leo," Noah called, looking up at me with those familiar gray eyes that he'd inherited from all three of his fathers. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure, buddy." "What is it?" "Are you going to marry my dads?" I choked on nothing. "What?" "Well, you live here now, and you smell like them, and you do all the mom stuff, so I figured you were already married. But you don't have rings, so I wasn't sure." I sputtered, not sure how to explain the complexities of a 3 Alpha 1 Omega relationship to a 7-year-old. "He's not wrong," Liam said, appearing in the doorway with his brothers flanking him. "We've been thinking about it, actually. We've been thinking about a lot of things." "Like what?" I asked, my heart starting to race. Ethan stepped forward, and I realized they were all holding something, small velvet boxes that made my breath catch in my throat. "Like this," he said, opening one of the boxes to reveal a ring that was perfect in its simplicity. "We want to do this properly, Leo. We want to make it official in every way that matters." "All three of you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "All three of us," Marcus confirmed. "Together. The way it should be." I looked at Noah, who was bouncing on his heels with barely contained excitement. I looked at the 3 alphas who had changed my life in more ways than I could count. And I looked at the rings they were offering me, symbols of a future I'd never dared to imagine. "Yes," I said. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Noah cheered. The triplets surrounded me, pressing kisses to my bonded marks, whispering promises about forever. And in that moment, surrounded by the family I'd found in the most unexpected way, I knew that everything had led to this. The sleepless nights, the impossible decisions, the terrifying leaps of faith. It had all been worth it. Epilogue, 5 years later. The castle was finally finished. Noah, now 12 and nearly as tall as my shoulder, stepped back to admire his handiwork. His block castles had become elaborate, intricate structures over the years, and this one was his masterpiece, a sprawling fortress with towers and battlements and a drawbridge that actually worked. "It's perfect," I said, and meant it. "You're just saying that because you're my..." He paused, searching for the word. "What are you again?" I can never remember which one to use. "I'm your parent," I said simply. "That's all you need to know." "But you're not my dad," he protested. You're just Leo." "Leo is enough," I said, and it was the truth. I'd never needed a title. I just needed to be here, in this family, where I'd always belonged. The triplets appeared in the doorway, and I watched their faces soften as they saw the scene before them, their son and their Omega, building something beautiful together, the way we'd always done. "Dinner's ready," Ethan said, and something in his voice made me look up. There was a softness there, a vulnerability that he'd learned to show only around us. "Coming," I said, but I stayed for a moment longer, watching Noah carefully place the final piece on his castle. He looked up at me, and there was so much trust in his eyes that it made my chest ache. "I'm glad you stayed," he said quietly. "After all these years, I'm still glad you stayed." "Me too, buddy," I said, pulling him into a hug. "Me too." The triplets joined us, wrapping their arms around both of us in a family embrace that had become as natural as breathing. And as we stood there, surrounded by the love we'd built together, I knew that this was exactly where I was meant to be. 3 alphas, 1 omega, 1 extraordinary child. Our family. Extra story. Leo woke to the familiar ache in his bones, the slow burn that started deep in his core and spread outward like wildfire through his veins. He'd been suppressing his heats for years, drowning them in pills and willpower and sheer stubbornness. But he'd been off the suppressants for almost 6 months now, and his body was making up for lost time. He didn't need to check the calendar to know what was coming. No, he thought, pressing his face into the pillow. Not now. Not yet. Please. But his body didn't care about his schedule. His heat was coming, the first proper one since his bonding, since the triplets had marked him and claimed him and made him theirs in every way that mattered. And this time, he wouldn't be facing it alone. Leo? Ethan's voice drifted through the bedroom door, low and warm. He'd already scented it. Leo could tell from the way the alpha's voice had that particular edge of concern, the careful control that meant he was holding back his instincts. I'm fine, Leo called back, but his voice cracked on the word, and they both knew it was a lie. The door opened, and all 3 of them stood there, Ethan in the center, flanked by Marcus and Liam like they'd coordinated their entrance. They had, probably. The triplets did everything with that kind of synchronized precision, even when they were just trying to check on their omega. Leo, Marcus said, his cool voice softening into something almost gentle. You're burning up. It's just a heat, Leo muttered, pulling the blanket up to his chin. I've had them before. I'll be fine. You had them alone, Liam pointed out, moving toward the bed with that restless energy that always made Leo feel like he was being hunted. You had them with suppressants messing up your system. This is different. Leo knew he was right. He could feel it in the way his skin prickled with heat, in the way his mind was already growing hazy around the edges. He'd spent years hiding from this part of himself, pretending it didn't exist, pretending he could be a normal person who didn't need the things his omega instincts craved. But he wasn't normal. And he'd never needed to pretend with them. Come here, Ethan said, settling onto the edge of the bed. Let us take care of you. That's what we're here for. I'm not going to break, Leo protested weakly, even as he leaned into Ethan's touch. We know, Marcus said, settling on his other side. But that doesn't mean you have to do this alone. The heat came faster than any of them expected. Within an hour, Leo was shaking, his body racked with waves of need that left him gasping and clinging to whichever alpha was closest. His scent flooded the room, honey and something floral, rich and intoxicating, so different from the blank nothingness he'd projected for years. He's beautiful like this, Liam breathed, his hands gentle as he brushed the hair from Leo's forehead. Completely undone. Don't make this weird, Leo growled, but there was no heat in it. Just need. Just want. Just the desperate craving for contact and comfort and the steady presence of his alphas around him. Ethan was the first to close the distance between them, pressing his lips to Leo's forehead, his cheek, the corner of his mouth. His scent deepened, cedar and spice, the familiar comfort of the alpha who had become Leo's anchor in every storm. This is going to be intense, Ethan murmured against his skin. We'll need to be careful. Monitor your temperature, your heart rate. Make sure you're staying hydrated. You're turning this into a medical conference, Leo complained weakly. He's not wrong, Marcus said, but there was a smile in his voice. But that doesn't mean we can't enjoy it too. The next 3 days were a blur of sensation. Leo lost all track of time, drifting in and out of consciousness on a tide of heat and pleasure and the constant presence of his alphas. They took turns watching over him, holding him, giving him exactly what he needed before he even knew he needed it. Water, Liam said at one point, pressing a glass to Leo's lips. Drink. All of it. Leo obeyed, his throat raw from crying out. He couldn't remember when he'd started making sound, but it felt like he'd been vocal for hours, all the control he'd so carefully cultivated stripped away by the heat burning through him. Good boy, Ethan murmured, his hand stroking Leo's hair. That's our Omega. Not your, Leo started to protest, but then Marcus's lips were on his bonding mark, and the words dissolved into a moan. Yes, you are, Marcus said, his voice low and possessive. You're ours, Leo. You've always been ours. Stop pretending otherwise. Leo didn't have the strength to argue. He didn't want to. The second day was the hardest. Leo's temperature spiked dangerously high, and the triplets had to strip him down and surround him with cool towels, their scents flooding the room to soothe him. He was delirious with need, barely recognizing his own surroundings, calling out for them when they left his side even for a moment. I'm here, Liam said, pressing his forehead to Leo's. I'm not going anywhere. None of us are. It hurts, Leo whimpered, curling into him. It hurts so much. I know, Liam soothed. I know it does. But it'll pass. We're getting through it together. Marcus appeared on Leo's other side, his cool hands pressing a fresh towel to Leo's forehead. His temperature is still too high, he reported to Ethan, his voice clipped and professional. We might need to consider the hospital. No, Leo gasped, grabbing Marcus's wrist. No hospital. Please. Just stay with me. All of you. Don't leave me. They didn't leave. 3 alphas, surrounding their Omega, anchoring him through the worst of it. They held him when he shook, soothed him when he cried, gave him everything he needed without asking for anything in return. By the 3rd day, the worst had passed. Leo was exhausted, wrung out like a rag that had been squeezed too many times. But the heat had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a clarity that felt almost jarring after the haze of the past few days. How are you feeling? Ethan asked, running his fingers gently through Leo's tangled hair. Like I got hit by a truck, Leo admitted, his voice hoarse. But better. Much better. Marcus pressed a kiss to his forehead. You did well, he said quietly. Better than we expected, honestly. Your body was fighting years of suppression, and you still came through it like a warrior. I had help, Leo said, looking at all 3 of them. I couldn't have done it alone. You'll never have to, Liam said simply. That's what bonding means. That's what we are. 2 weeks later, Leo started throwing up every morning. It started subtly, a wave of nausea that hit him when he woke up, fading after a few minutes. He dismissed it as a stomach bug, then as stress, then as a reaction to the new scent diffuser Liam had bought for the penthouse. But when he started getting dizzy at work, stumbling through his presentations with a queasy smile, Ethan pulled him aside and told him to see a doctor. It's probably nothing, Leo insisted, even as his face went pale. I've just been working too hard. You're going to see a doctor, Ethan said, his CEO voice making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. We have a family physician. I'll make the appointment. You don't need to. Leo. Ethan's voice softened, and he reached out to cup Leo's face. You're terrified, aren't you? You already know what this might be. Leo closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. I don't know anything. I've been having these dreams. These feelings. Like something's changed, and I can't figure out what. Then let's find out, Ethan said gently. Together. The 3 of us. You're not doing this alone, Leo. None of us are going anywhere. The doctor's office was sleek and clinical, the kind of place that catered to people who didn't have to worry about insurance copays. Leo sat on the examination table, his hands shaking, while the triplets stood in a tight formation by the window, radiating barely controlled anxiety. "Mr. Carter," the doctor said, a calm beta with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. "Your test results are back." Leo felt his stomach drop. "And? You're pregnant." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Leo's vision went white around the edges, and he had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling off. Are you sure?" He heard himself ask, his voice distant and strange in his own ears. "The test is definitive," the doctor said, smiling. "Congratulations. You're going to have a baby." "But I'm an Omega. I'm male. I can't." "You can," the doctor said gently. "Biology is more flexible than people think, and you've been off suppressants for a significant period of time. It's not common, but it's certainly possible, especially with how strong your bond with your partners is. The bond has been helping your body stabilize and prepare." Leo was still processing, still trying to wrap his mind around the impossible news, when he felt Ethan's hand on his shoulder. "A baby," Ethan said, his voice cracking on the word. "We're having a baby." "We?" Leo repeated numbly. "You carried it," Marcus said, his cool exterior finally cracking into something raw and overwhelmed. "You grew it. But we made it happen, all of us. Together." Liam was already crying, tears streaming down his face as he moved to embrace Leo. "A baby," he repeated. "Our baby. Another one to join our family." The first trimester was the hardest. Leo was exhausted, nauseous, and impossibly sensitive to scents. He couldn't be in the same room as Liam's leather cologne, had to leave the penthouse entirely when Ethan cooked the wrong thing, and spent more time in the bathroom than he did anywhere else. But through it all, the triplets were there. They brought him ginger tea and saltine crackers, held his hair back when he was sick, and wrapped him in blankets and elfin warmth when he was shivering. Noah, now 8 and endlessly curious, had taken to bringing Leo drawings and school projects, determined to make his Omega parent feel better. "Is the baby going to have 3 dads like me?" Noah asked one evening, his small face pressed to Leo's stomach. "I think so," Leo said, running his fingers through the boy's hair. "Either that or 2 dads and 1 parent. We'll figure it out when they get here." "I hope it's a boy," Noah said decisively. "I want a little brother." "What if it's a girl?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. "Then I'll have a sister," Noah said, as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. "That's fine too. I just want someone to play with." The second trimester was easier. Leo's nausea faded, replaced by a steady energy that surprised everyone. He started showing, a small round bump that made the triplets go absolutely feral with possessiveness. They couldn't keep their hands off him, always touching, always scenting, always making sure he was safe and healthy and happy. "You're glowing," Liam said one evening, pressing a kiss to Leo's cheek. "I don't know how you're doing this, but you're making it look easy." "I have a lot of help," Leo said, leaning back against Ethan's chest. 3 alphas who won't let me lift a finger, a kid who brings me snacks every 5 minutes, and a body that's finally cooperating for once." "You deserve it," Marcus said, setting a plate of cut fruit on the table beside him. "After everything you've been through, after everything you've given us, you deserve to be pampered." Leo rolled his eyes, but he was smiling. "You're all ridiculous. You know that, right?" "Ridiculously in love with you," Liam corrected. "There's a difference." The third trimester was hard again. Leo was huge, uncomfortable, and ready to be done. The baby was active, rolling and kicking at all hours, and Leo found himself exhausted despite sleeping more than he ever had in his life. "I can't do this anymore," he said one evening, tears of frustration streaming down his face. "I can't, I'm so tired, and I'm so hungry, and I can't even get comfortable anymore." Ethan held him, rocking him gently, while Marcus brought him a heating pad for his aching back and Liam made him a cup of tea. "You're so close," Ethan soothed. "Almost there. The baby's almost ready, and then you'll be free. And then we'll have a newborn," Liam added, grinning. "Which means even less sleep." "Not helping," Leo muttered, but he was laughing too. The labor started in the middle of the night. Leo woke to a deep, rolling pain that stole his breath and made him cry out. He was on his feet before he'd even fully registered what was happening, his hand clutching the edge of the bed as another wave of pain washed over him. "Leo?" Ethan was awake instantly, his hand on Leo's back, his scent flooding the room with soothing alpha pheromones. "What's wrong?" "The baby," Leo gasped. I think they're coming." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Marcus called the doctor. Liam helped Leo change into comfortable clothes. Ethan held Leo's hand through every contraction, refusing to let go even when Leo squeezed hard enough to break his fingers. "You're doing so well," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "You're so strong. You're amazing." "I'm not amazing," Leo gritted out. "I'm in pain, and I want this baby out." "You're definitely amazing," Marcus said, appearing at his side. "We couldn't do this without you." "We definitely couldn't," Liam added. "We don't have the right equipment." Leo laughed through another contraction, and it came out as more of a sob. "You're all ridiculous. You know that?" "We know," they said in unison, and Leo felt something that might have been love swelling in his chest, even through the pain. The birth was intense. Leo pushed for what felt like hours, his body screaming with exhaustion even as the triplets stayed with him, coaching him through every contraction. Ethan held his hand, Marcus held his back, and Liam watched the proceedings with barely contained tears in his eyes. "One more push," the doctor instructed. "You're almost there, Leo. Just one more." Leo summoned every ounce of strength he had left and pushed, a scream tearing from his throat as the pressure finally released and he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a baby's first cry. "You did it," Ethan breathed, tears streaming down his face. "Leo, you did it. You're incredible. You're everything." The doctor placed a small, squirming bundle on Leo's chest, and Leo looked down at his child for the first time. The baby was perfect, a tiny, perfect person with a shock of dark hair and a pair of angry lungs that announced their presence to the entire floor. Leo felt something shift in his chest, a love so vast and overwhelming that it threatened to drown him. "You had a baby," Marcus said, his voice hushed with awe. "You had our baby." "We have a baby," Leo corrected, and the words felt like a miracle in his mouth. Liam was the first to touch the baby, his finger gently stroking the tiny cheek. "They're so small. So perfect. What are we going to name them?" Ethan asked, his voice thick with emotion. Leo looked at the tiny person in his arms, this child who was the culmination of everything they'd built together. "I've been thinking about it," he said softly. "If it's a boy, I thought, Alexander. It means defender. After everything our family's been through, it feels right." "Alexander," Marcus repeated, testing the name. "Alexander Howard. I like it. I want to meet Alexander," Liam said, already hovering. "Please. I need to hold them." "You'll have to wait," the doctor said, gently removing the baby to clean them. "But soon. Very soon." Leo was exhausted, bruised, and completely in love. He lay in the hospital bed, watching the triplets crowd around their new child like they were the most precious thing in the world. They were arguing about who got to hold Alexander first, but it was the kind of good-natured bickering that made Leo smile. "I'm the oldest," Ethan was saying. "I should get first dibs." "You always get first dibs," Liam protested. "I should get a turn." "You both get a turn," Marcus said, "after I've had mine." Leo laughed, a sound that came out tired and raw. "You're all such ridiculous alphas. Like none of you are ever going to see him again." "We're just excited," Liam said, looking at Leo with so much love in his eyes that it made Leo's chest ache. "We're just really, really excited." "I know," Leo said, holding out his arms. "Now give me my child back. I need to hold them. I carried them for 9 months, I think I deserve first turn." The triplets looked at each other, and then they moved as one, carefully transferring Alexander back into Leo's arms. The baby was sleeping now, their small chest rising and falling with each breath, and Leo felt a peace settle over him that he'd never experienced before. "He's so perfect," Leo whispered, looking at his son, their son, the child of an Omega and 3 alphas, built on love and trust and the kind of connection that most people only dreamed about. "He is," Ethan said, pressing a kiss to Leo's forehead. "And you made him. You made our family whole, Leo. First Noah, now Alexander, none of this would have happened without you." "We would have been lost without you," Marcus added, taking Leo's hand. "I don't know how we survived before you crawled under that desk and changed everything." "You didn't crawl under anything," Liam corrected, grinning. "He was under the desk. You were just sitting there like a normal person." "That's not the point," Marcus said. "The point," Ethan interrupted, "is that we're here. All of us. Together. And we're never going to be anything else." 3 days later, the family was back in the penthouse. Noah had been introduced to Alexander the day after the birth, and he'd immediately appointed himself the baby's protector. He slept beside the bassinet every night, ready to call his fathers if the baby so much as whimpered. "I'm going to be the best big brother ever," Noah announced, his face utterly serious. "I'm going to teach him how to play blocks, and how to draw, and how to hide from my dads when they're being annoying." "We're never annoying," Liam said, pretending to be offended. "You're always annoying," Noah said, and all 3 triplets dissolved into laughter. Leo sat on the couch, Alexander sleeping peacefully in his arms, and watched his family fall into chaos around him. Noah was chasing Liam around the living room, Marcus was trying to work despite the noise, and Ethan had given up on any semblance of order and was just watching the mayhem with a contented smile. "I love you," Leo said quietly, and the words were meant for all of them. Ethan turned to look at him, his eyes soft. "We love you too, Leo. We always will. Even when I'm grumpy. Especially when you're grumpy. Even when I don't want to get out of bed. We'll bring you breakfast. Even when I—" "Leo," Ethan interrupted, moving to sit beside him. "Yes. Always yes. You're the center of our family. Nothing you do will ever change that." Leo leaned into him, his eyes closing as the warmth of his alpha surrounded him. Alexander stirred in his arms, and Leo felt the familiar swell of love that never failed to overwhelm him. He'd started this journey alone, lost, suppressing everything that made him who he was, convinced that he'd never belong anywhere. And now he had everything. 3 alphas who loved him, a son who adored him, and a new baby who was the physical embodiment of all the impossible, wonderful things that had happened since that night under the desk. "I never expected any of this," Leo murmured. "I never thought I'd have a family like this." "Neither did we," Ethan said. "But we do. And we're never letting you go." The baby opened his eyes, and Leo looked down into the familiar gray gaze he'd fallen in love with months ago, now reflected in his newborn son. "Welcome to the family, Alexander," Leo whispered. "You have 3 dads, a big brother, and an Omega parent who's going to make sure you never feel unwanted for a single second of your life." Alexander gurgled, and Leo felt the triplets close in around him, a wall of warmth and love that surrounded him on all sides. "We are so lucky," Liam said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "We are," Marcus agreed. "Completely, impossibly lucky." "Lucky doesn't cover it," Ethan said, his hand finding Leo's and squeezing gently. "This is something else. Something bigger." "What is it, then?" Leo asked, looking up at the 3 alphas who had become his world. They looked at each other, and Leo watched the silent communication pass between them, the synchronized understanding that only triplets could truly share. "It's love," they said together. "That's all it's ever been. And it's all it's ever going to be." Leo smiled, feeling the last of his walls crumble. "Yeah," he said, looking down at Alexander, who was already falling back asleep. "Love. That's exactly what this is." 1 year later. The penthouse was chaos. Noah was chasing Alexander around the living room, both boys shrieking with laughter as they played their own version of tag. Alexander had just learned to walk, and he was determined to make up for all the time he'd spent immobile. "Slow down," Leo called, laughing. "You're going to hurt yourselves." "We're fine," Noah shouted back. "I'm careful." He wasn't careful. He was the most reckless child Leo had ever met, and Alexander was following in his footsteps with breathtaking speed. The triplets were in the kitchen, preparing dinner, a collaborative effort that usually ended with more food on the floor than on the table. Ethan was chopping vegetables, Marcus was manning the stove, and Liam was pretending to help while actually sneaking pieces of cheese to the children. "You're spoiling them," Leo said, appearing in the doorway. "They deserve to be spoiled," Liam said, tossing another piece of cheese toward Noah. "Look at them. They're perfect." "They're a menace," Leo corrected, but he was smiling. "They're your menace. All yours." "Ours," Ethan corrected, wrapping an arm around Leo's waist. "Our family. Our chaos. Our perfectly imperfect life. And I wouldn't trade it for anything," Leo said, leaning into him. Later that night, when the boys were finally asleep and the penthouse had fallen quiet, Leo stood on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. The triplets found him there, as they always did, and surrounded him with their warmth and their scent and their love. "You're thinking," Marcus observed. "What's on your mind?" "Nothing," Leo said. "Just, how did I get so lucky? How did this happen to me?" "We've been over this," Liam said, pressing a kiss to the back of his neck. "You didn't get lucky. You got chosen. And then you chose us back. We were waiting for you," Ethan added. "Waiting for someone who could see past the suits and the titles and the carefully controlled exteriors. And then you came along, and you were everything." "Everything," Marcus echoed. Leo looked at the 3 of them, these alphas who had become his entire world, who had given him everything he'd never known he needed. And he knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that this was exactly where he was meant to be. "We're going to need a bigger house," he said finally. "The boys are growing, and we're probably going to have more eventually." The triplets exchanged a look. "Is that a hint?" Liam asked, his eyes bright with laughter. "It's a warning," Leo said, grinning. "I'm going to keep you all on your toes forever." "We're ready for it," Ethan said, pulling him close. "We've been ready since the moment you took a chance on us," Marcus added. "That's good," Leo said, looking up at them. "Because I'm not going anywhere." "Neither are we," they said together. And standing there, surrounded by the family he'd built out of nothing, Leo realized that this was what he'd been searching for his entire life, the feeling of being truly, completely, irrevocably home. The end.